So I was browsing Reddit some time ago and I came across the idea of AMD FineWine Technology. What it essentially is a joke that AMD graphics cards start out with less performance and then get gradually better as its drivers mature, hence the name Fine Wine. So I decided to look into this myself and compare driver revisions of my R9 380. To do the testing, I had it running in my personal computer, which features an i7-2600 non-K, which I boosted to run at 3.9 GHz on all 4 cores, and 16 GB of DDR3 RAM. The computer runs Windows 10 Pro, and the 380 in question is the Sapphire Nitro 4 GB version, running at 1010 MHz core clock and 1450 MHz memory clock. I selected driver versions using only WHQO drivers spaced roughly 2 to 3 months apart, starting with launch day drivers and ending with the latest official drivers. So without further ado, let's get to the benchmarks. First off is 3D Mark Firestrike to see how the drivers would perform in a perfect roll scenario. I ran a custom test with only the 2 GPU tests but left everything else the same. 15.12 was an outlier here, giving a randomly lower score, while all of the other drivers fell within 1 frame of each other. Although you can argue that the frame rate has increased since launch, the newer drivers did just barely improve upon the card, with a barely noticeable 2% increase over launch drivers. Next on the line is GTA 5. I tested by setting everything on high with max population density, max distance scaling, no reflection MSAA, FXAA on, 2x MSAA, AMD CHS soft shadows, normal post FX, and 16x anisotropic filtering. FPS was recorded with fraps and I used only the last portion of the in-game benchmark. As we can see, there was almost no difference between the different driver versions. However, there was one weird quirk. When I first ran the benchmark on 16.7.3 drivers, GTA 5 crashed almost immediately. The second run then had one random framerate drop, but otherwise ran smoothly. I personally think the minimums don't matter here, as I believe the minimum framerate is a result of a CPU bottleneck, as it is a very CPU intensive game. The latest few drivers had almost identical numbers, but 15.12 gave the highest numbers. In terms of stability, they were all almost about the same. Next up is Dirt 3, which is a very well optimized game. I ran the in-game benchmark, which gave me numbers for a minimum and average at the end of each test. The settings were all on ultra, and I was still seeing pretty consistent frame rates between each driver revision. It seems the frame rates went up first, but then dropped again, but all the results were within 2% of each other. As with 3D Mark, the 16.9.2 drivers gave ever so slightly lower numbers than everything else. One thing I'd like to point out is that the latest 17.2.1 drivers has been getting consistently lower scores in all of our previous tests, although not noticeably lower. But in Dirt 3, we see a very obvious drop in the minimum frame rate and a minor reduction in averages. Rainbow Six Siege had some very interesting results. I ran the in-game benchmark on the Ultra preset. Do note that when starting the game on 15.7.1, I received a notification stating that my drivers were unsupported. Nevertheless, the averages were all very close to each other, with a very slight gradual increase of about 2%. This is the first game to break the trend of 17.2.1 being the lowest, with the latest driver seeing the highest score out of all the others. But what's more intriguing is the minimums and maximums. It seems that as drivers gradually matured, they got more stable, with less framerate drops and spikes. Finally, I tested Battlefield 1 to see how that performs. I tested by playing the opening mission until the first death, using the high preset in both DirectX 11 and DirectX 12 modes. Now unfortunately, Battlefield 1 refused to start on drivers older than 16.7.3. The game would just not launch and give me an error, saying that I need to update the drivers. So, I only have the results for 16.7.3 drivers or later. In DX11 mode, the new drivers received a noticeable bump in performance from 16.7.3 to 16.9.2, but stayed the same after that. DX12 told a similar story, where the performance went up slightly between those two drivers, but this time the newer drivers also seemed to improve stability. In 16.12.1, the minimum frame rate was 33, but that was due to just one random frame rate drop. The rest of the benchmark felt fine. The latest driver, 17.2.1, gave the highest number for DX11 but had a slightly lower number for DX12. I think this may be due to the fact that DX12 run was the only run where I spent most of my time on fire, while the other runs I was only set on fire briefly before I died. This might have affected frame rate slightly, but still keeps us within the margin of error. So conclusion? Well, the results varied from game to game, but in general there were no major improvements in anything. The games that we did see improvements were minor, while most interestingly in some games the frame stability went up. But does this mean that AMD FineWine Technology doesn't exist? Not quite. Although small, there is a chance that frame rates could have gone up from the game updates as well, where developers learned to optimize for AMD hardware later down the line. But the likelihood of this is rather small due to the amount of games tested. It could also be that this specific card did not gain as much attention from the driver team and was simply left to be. But to test that, I would need a larger pool of graphics cards, which I do not have. So this whole video essentially waters down to results inconclusive, further testing is needed. Yep, that's it for today then. Thank you guys for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please leave a like, dislike it if you felt it was a waste of your time. Feel free to leave a comment suggesting how I could improve, and until next time, peace out.